Today, for the first time since December of 2022, a gallon of diesel fuel crossed $5 in the United States, not in California, not in one overpriced city on one expensive coast. The national average. According to AAA, it is $5.04 per gallon as of this morning, March 17th. The Energy Information Administration puts it at $5.07. In California, it is $6.49. In Washington State, $6.11. Hawaii is sitting at $6.01. 9 weeks ago, before the war with Iran began, diesel was $3.46 per gallon. In 63 days, the cost of moving every product on every road in America has gone up 46%. There have been 33 times in recorded history that the national average for diesel crossed $5 per gallon. 32 of those times were in 2022, when Russia invaded Ukraine and energy markets shattered. All 32. The 33rd is today, and unlike 2022, this one has not peaked. New York Harbor ultra-low sulfur diesel futures are trading at $3.80 per gallon. That is not the pump price. That is the wholesale price where the chain begins, before retail markup, before taxes, before the price you see at the truck stop. It is up 46% since February 28th. The crack spread, the margin between the price of crude oil and the price of finished diesel, sits near $64 per barrel. One of the widest gaps since the last major crisis. That spread is telling you something. It is telling you that diesel is not just following crude oil higher. It is running away from it. Something specific is collapsing on the supply side of refined fuel, and whatever that collapse is, it is already in the mail, headed for your grocery bill. Here is what most people do not know about diesel. The gasoline in your car is your problem. Diesel is everyone's problem. Every freight truck on the American highway runs on diesel. Every long-haul refrigerated truck carrying vegetables from California to Ohio, every tractor planting corn in Iowa, every combine harvesting wheat in Kansas, every backhoe on a construction site, every container ship waiting to load at a port, all of them burn diesel. The American Trucking Association has made the dependency concrete. Grocery stores would run out of food within 3 days if trucks stopped running. 70.5% of all food in America travels by truck at some point between the farm and your table, not a subset of it, not specialty imports. The chicken, the eggs, the bread, the frozen vegetables, the milk, all of it, at some point in its journey, sits in a diesel-powered trailer moving down a highway, and the dependency does not stop at food. Construction materials move by diesel, medical supplies move by diesel, lumber, steel, concrete, all of it arrives by truck. When diesel prices spike this sharply, this quickly, the entire cost structure of the physical economy recalibrates. When that trailer's fuel costs 46% more than it did 2 months ago, the economics of that movement change. And that change does not stay in the trucking company's books. It cannot. A small carrier running 10 trucks on a thin margin does not have the reserves to absorb a $1.58 jump in fuel. They raise their rates or they park their trucks. Both outcomes send the same signal up the chain. Here is the arithmetic. Fuel accounts for roughly 21% of total cost per mile for a trucking carrier, according to the American Transportation Research Institute. When diesel rises from $3.46 to $5.04, a jump of $1.58 per gallon, the fuel cost per mile for a truck running 7 miles per gallon increases by more than 20 cents. A load of food traveling from California to New York covers roughly 3,000 miles. That is over $600 added to a single freight run, before driver wages, before insurance, before the truck payment. $600 added to the cost of one trip. Now multiply that by the 2 million registered commercial trucks running American roads. Multiply by every weekly delivery to every warehouse and distribution center in the country. The number becomes too large to absorb quietly inside any industry, so it migrates. Relentlessly, layer by layer, from the trucker to the shipper to the distributor to the retailer and then to you at the checkout. This migration is not theoretical. Research from the University of California at Davis documented that a diesel price shock passes through to food retail prices with a total effect that peaks at 4 to 7 months after the initial shock. The food prices for March 2026 diesel will fully arrive at the grocery store around July and August. You will not notice the connection. You will see higher prices and call it inflation. But the mechanism is right here, sitting in the fuel that moved the food. The delayed lag is actually the most dangerous part of this. If the diesel spike hit your grocery bill the same week, people would scream and politicians would act fast. Instead, the shock absorbs slowly and silently across the supply chain. By the time the full cost shows up in your shopping cart, the news cycle has moved on. The link between a closed strait in the Middle East and the price of a gallon of milk in Ohio in August is invisible until you actually trace it step by step all the way down. So why is diesel at $5? The answer starts on February 28, 2026. On that morning, the United States and Israel launched coordinated airstrikes on Iran in an operation called Epic Fury. The targets were nuclear facilities, military command infrastructure, and senior leadership. Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, was killed in the first wave of strikes. What followed was not a swift, contained military conclusion. It was the opening of the most economically destructive regional conflict in the modern history of energy markets. Iran's response was to close the Strait of Hormuz, and that sentence explains every price in this story. The Strait of Hormuz is a narrow waterway at its narrowest point, 39 kilometers wide, connecting the Persian Gulf to the Gulf of Oman and the open ocean. Through it flows approximately 20 million barrels of oil per day. That is 1/5 of all oil moving anywhere on Earth. The entire world consumes roughly 105 million barrels of oil every day. 1/5 of that volume, 1 out of every 5 barrels produced on the planet, passes through a channel that is narrower than some American counties. When Iran effectively closed the strait through drone attacks on shipping, mines in the water, and military threats to vessels in transit, that 20 million barrels did not reroute through pipelines. Most of it simply stopped. And then the Gulf's refineries began going dark. Saudi Aramco's Ras Tanura refinery, Saudi Arabia's largest domestic processing facility, handling more than 500,000 barrels per day, was struck by Iranian drones in early March and halted production. The UAE's Ruwais refinery, with a combined capacity of 922,000 barrels per day, shut its main crude distillation unit after a drone strike and fire on the complex. Bahrain's Babco Energies declared force majeure after strikes on its 380,000 barrel per day Sitra refinery. Kuwait's 3 refineries began cutting their processing rates as storage tanks filled and tankers could not exit the strait. These are not minor footnotes. These Gulf refineries produce the middle distillates diesel, jet fuel, heating oil that the global economy runs on. They do not just move crude oil. They transform it into the specific refined products the world depends on. When they go dark, you cannot replace that refining capacity overnight just by finding more crude. The International Energy Agency's March 2026 oil market report documented the damage in terms that were, for a central bank report, unusually stark. In 2025, Gulf producers had been exporting 3.3 million barrels per day of refined petroleum products. That flow is now largely frozen. Asian diesel and jet fuel cash premiums surged to multi-year highs within days. Singapore complex refining margins hit $30 a barrel. Gas oil crack spreads cleared $48. The IEA called this the largest supply disruption in the history of the global oil market, larger than the 1973 OPEC embargo, larger than the 1990 Gulf War. Goldman Sachs used the same framing: the largest oil supply shock on record. At least 10 million barrels per day of supply has been curtailed. Brent crude crossed $100 per barrel. West Texas Intermediate briefly cleared 119 before settling back toward the mid-90s. The one-week jump in the national diesel average recorded by the EIA on March 9th was 96 cents per gallon, the single largest weekly increase in the agency's entire data history. The previous record was 74.5 cents, set in the first days of the Russia-Ukraine war in 2022. This shattered it by more than 20 cents in 1 week. Now follow the money from that wreckage to your checkout screen. The first thing that moves is the fuel surcharge. American trucking contracts carry fuel surcharge mechanisms tables updated weekly against the Department of Energy's published average, designed to pass diesel cost changes directly through to shippers. The moment diesel crossed $4.80, those tables updated. When it crossed $5, they updated again. One freight broker reported a more than 35% increase in the cost of a single freight run before this week's numbers were even published. Shippers receive that cost. Most cannot absorb it because margins in freight and distribution are not wide enough to quietly swallow a fuel spike of this magnitude, so they pass it to distributors. Distributors pass it to retailers. Retailers pass it to you. The chain is not complicated, it is just invisible, because none of those handoffs carry a label that says diesel surcharge. The foods most exposed to this chain are not luxury goods. They are staples. Fresh produce is diesel intensive because it is perishable and must travel fast and far. Most of America's vegetables and fruit are grown in a small number of agricultural states and consumed everywhere else. Refrigerated goods require reefer trucks running diesel continuously throughout the haul. Meat, dairy, and eggs are cold chain goods that spend significant time on diesel-powered transport. The University of Georgia's Department of Agricultural and Applied Economics stated directly that the initial impact concentrates in foods that are truck-intensive, perishable, refrigerated, and grown far from demand centers. In other words, the perimeter of the grocery store, the produce section, the meat counter, the dairy aisle, where people shop for real food, and then it moves inward. Bread requires grain, which requires diesel to plant, harvest, and transport to a mill. Canned goods require the raw ingredients to reach a processing facility by truck, and the finished products to leave that facility the same way. Even things that seem stationary, the shelves in the grocery store, the refrigeration units running the dairy case, those were built from materials that arrived by diesel-powered transport. The diesel price is not in one line of the store. It is in every line. Beyond groceries, the chain extends to every category of goods that moves by road. UPS and FedEx raised surcharges on shipments within days of the conflict starting. That is the early visible signal. The second wave is broader freight cost increases embedded across every carrier's rate sheet. The third wave, the one that takes longest and lands hardest, is built into the cost of manufactured goods, construction materials, agricultural inputs, and anything else that moves by ground before it reaches you. The U.S. Department of Agriculture's Economic Research Service was, as of January of this year, already projecting overall food prices to rise 3.1% in 2026. That forecast was built on conditions that no longer exist. It did not account for the Hormuz closure. It did not account for the largest Gulf refinery disruption in a generation. The actual food inflation number for this year is going to be higher. How much higher depends on one variable: how long the strait stays closed. Goldman Sachs had a word this week for what the combination of spiking diesel, constrained supply, and slowing growth produces. They used the word stagflation. It is a word that carries weight because of what it meant the last time it was widely used. In the 1970s, stagflation destroyed household wealth across an entire decade. Inflation ran double digits. Interest rates were raised so high to fight it that the economy was deliberately pushed into recession twice. The cure was nearly as painful as the disease. The question the market is asking right now is whether we are at the beginning of that kind of episode or whether this resolves quickly before it becomes structural. The answer depends almost entirely on the Strait of Hormuz. On March 12th, the bank raised its 12-month recession probability to 25%, up 5 percentage points in a single revision, after a brutal February jobs report and surging oil prices forced their economists to rewrite their outlook. February payrolls fell 92,000. Goldman's estimate of the underlying job creation trend sits barely above zero, and then oil happened on top of a labor market that was already showing cracks. The bank raised its year-end headline inflation forecast by 0.8 percentage points to 2.9% and cut its GDP growth projection by 0.3 percentage points to 2.2%. Then it did something more specific. It pushed its Federal Reserve rate cut call from June to September, with a second cut in December. Think about what that means for your financial life right now. The Federal Reserve had been expected to reduce interest rates starting in June, which would have started pulling mortgage rates down. That window is now closed until September at the earliest. If you've been waiting to refinance your home, your variable rate mortgage just got more expensive for longer. If you carry debt that adjusts to the federal funds rate, the war in Iran bought that rate more time at its current level. Higher fuel costs act like a tax that returns no value. Households do not get more out of the economy for the extra money they spend on energy. They just have less left over for everything else: restaurants, travel, savings, school supplies. The fuel cost acts as a permanent drain on household spending power, a drain that compounds as it moves through grocery prices, freight costs, and every other category that diesel touches. Goldman noted another layer. The bank estimated that existing tariffs had already added more than 70 basis points to core inflation before this oil shock arrived. The Fed is now being squeezed from two directions simultaneously. The labor market is soft enough to argue for cutting rates. The inflation path driven by oil and tariff effects together argues for holding. When a central bank is caught between a slowing economy and rising prices at the same time, the standard toolkit does not work cleanly. You cannot cut to support growth without risking that inflation runs hotter. You cannot hold to contain inflation without adding pressure to a labor market that is already fragile. That is the definition of a policy bind. And prediction markets are pricing it accordingly. Kalshi traders were showing recession odds near 34% in early March. Polymarket similar. These are real money bets on a serious probability that the United States enters recession before the year is out. Oxford Economics modeled an extreme scenario where global crude averages $140 per barrel for 2 months. Their term for it was a breaking point for the world economy. We are not there. Brent is above $100, not $140. But the distance between where we are and that threshold has narrowed considerably. Here is the part that should stop you. The United States is the world's largest oil producer. American crude output is at record levels. The Permian Basin is pumping hard. Shale production is running near capacity. And yet the country is sitting with diesel at $5 a gallon and rising. How is that possible? The answer is that producing crude oil and producing diesel are two different operations that live in two different parts of the global economy. America produces crude. The global refining system, particularly the Gulf refineries that processed hundreds of thousands of barrels per day before this month, converts crude into the middle distillates that power trucks, trains, ships, and farms. When a significant portion of that refining capacity goes dark simultaneously, domestic crude production cannot fill the gap. You cannot put crude oil in a diesel engine. The product the truck needs comes out of a refinery. And the refineries that produce it are sitting behind a closed strait. The IEA estimated that about 4.2 million barrels per day of the oil that normally passes through Hormuz can be redirected through existing pipelines. That leaves approximately 16 million barrels per day with no alternative route if the strait stays closed. Goldman made the same point explicitly. Pipeline capacity exists for a fraction of the flow. The rest has nowhere to go. America's domestic production record means nothing to the diesel crack spread when the refineries that make diesel cannot operate. This is the economic paradox of the Iran war. The United States is energy independent in the crude sense. It is not energy independent in the refined product sense. It is embedded in a global supply chain for middle distillates that runs through the Persian Gulf. And when that chain breaks, the price signal travels instantaneously to every fuel surcharge table, every freight contract, and every grocery shelf in America, regardless of how many barrels are coming out of Texas. There is a word for what happens when military action produces an economic consequence. The country cannot escape using its own domestic resources. The economists call it a supply shock. Everyone else calls it a tax. You did not choose this war. You were not consulted about what a Hormuz closure would cost. But as of this morning, you are paying for it at $5.04 per gallon every time a truck loaded with food pulls out of a warehouse, every time a tractor rolls down a row of a field, every time a ship waits at anchor because the insurance math no longer works. The war is 2.5 weeks old. The diesel shock is already the largest in 4 years. The grocery bill follows. The question is not whether the economic cost of this conflict reaches American households. It already has. The only open question is how long it stays. Let me leave you with something concrete, not the geopolitical picture you have that now. The part that connects the mechanism we just walked through to the decisions people are actually facing. Step back from the narrative for a moment. What follows is professional analysis grounded in the framework this script laid out, not a personal recommendation for your specific situation. Principle 1. Inflation and purchasing power of savings. Every sustained energy shock in the historical record has eroded the real value of cash and short-term savings. According to Federal Reserve research on the transmission of oil shocks to consumer prices, the 1973 and 1979 episodes both produced inflation that ran above savings account yields for multiple years, meaning money sitting in a bank account lost purchasing power in real terms, even while earning nominal interest. The diesel to freight to grocery mechanism described in this script is precisely the channel that historical studies identified as slow burning and difficult to reverse. A savings account yielding 4% while food and freight inflation runs at 3 to 5% does not preserve wealth. It erodes it on a delay. Principle 2, mortgage rates and variable rate exposure. The Federal Reserve's delayed easing path cuts pushed to September and December has direct consequences for anyone with a mortgage or variable rate debt. As documented in Federal Reserve research on monetary policy transmission, rate cut delays extend elevated borrowing costs and suppress refinancing activity. If your mortgage adjusts to the federal funds rate or you carry consumer debt tied to prime, the Iran war has effectively extended your cost exposure by at least 3 months, beyond what the market was pricing a month ago. Principle 3. Equity markets in stagflationary conditions. The S&P 500 and broad index funds historically underperform in genuine stagflationary environments. According to Bank for International Settlements research on the relationship between inflation regimes and equity returns, periods combining rising input costs with compressed growth and elevated rates produce valuation multiple compression, meaning stocks fall not just because earnings are lower, but because the price investors are willing to pay for each dollar of earnings declines. Goldman's current framing higher inflation, slower growth, delayed cuts describes that combination precisely. Principle 4. Gold and supply-driven inflation. According to World Gold Council data covering 50 years of commodity cycles, gold has historically functioned as a purchasing power hedge, specifically during supply-driven inflationary episodes when prices are rising because a commodity is scarce, not because demand is overheating. The 1973 OPEC embargo and the 1990 Gulf War both produced sustained gold price appreciation. The current shock shares the same structural profile: production disruption, not demand excess. That distinction matters. Supply shocks tend to be stickier than demand shocks, and the hedge functions differently. The question worth sitting with: if the Strait of Hormuz stays partially closed for 6 months, which of your current financial positions is built to handle a world where inflation stays elevated, rate cuts are delayed, and growth slows simultaneously?